Welcome, and thank you everyone for joining today's TÜV complimentary webinar titled Assessing Risks and Monitoring Performance for Sustainable Supply Chains, presented by our guest speakers today, Alberto Sartori, Global Product Manager for the social area of TÜV Business Assurance, and Harald Nitschinger, Co-founder and Managing Director at Prewave. Before we begin the presentation today, we have a few housekeeping rules. If you or someone you know is having trouble connecting, please advise them to connect through LAN instead of a Wi-Fi for better connectivity. Also, please view this webinar through the recommended browsers of Chrome, Firefox, or Edge, if available. All participants are muted to avoid any background noise during the webinar. And there may be a time lag between slides. If you are having a problem, please mention it in the chat window, which is at the bottom of your screen, the fourth tab over. For the question and answers portion of today's session, please submit your questions via the Q&A tab, again at the bottom of the screen, the fifth button over. Now let me introduce TÜV as well as our session today. TÜV is world-renowned for providing international testing, assessment, training, and certification services for over 150 years, with offices in over 1,000 locations in 50 countries and represented by over 28,000 employees. As a global leader in management system certification, validation, and verification audits, TÜV's extensive industry experience and expertise elevate the management systems of our clients through our unique approach to audits. We assist companies of all sizes with a tailored audit approach specific to your company size and industry. We can support you with various ISO-based management system standards, as well as cybersecurity initiatives, customized audit solutions, and of course, assisting your company with sustainability in the supply chain. If you are looking for a trusted, globally recognized provider that is responsive to assist with your company's transformation and certification needs, TÜV is your partner. And we help drive your success across the whole business cycle, covering all areas of your business, including planning, design, manufacturing, construction, organization, optimization, decommissioning, and more. And for today's session, conducting due diligence across supply chains has become imperative in today's global market. Compliance with these requirements and others will help companies to proactively avoid future business risks, such as penalties, loss of business, and brand reputation. Such impacts can be resource and labor intensive, disturbing global innovation, product launches, and last mile delivery. As mentioned, Harald and Alberto will address questions at the end of today's session, and questions can be submitted online via the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Today's session will be recorded, and the on-demand replay will be available soon after the event. And now I would like to turn it over to our featured speakers, Alberto and Harald. Welcome. Thank you for presenting.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you very much. Happy to be here and take you through our information and proposals for better supply chain management. As you can see in this overview slide, we will start by introducing the evolving regulations at global level on supply chain due diligence. This is a global trend. Some of these regulations listed here have already entered into force. Some others are in pipeline, still under discussion. But a clear trend is can be seen at global level. Pressure on business is increasing to demonstrating the sustainability of their own operations as well as of their entire supply chains. This creates new challenges for companies to ensure compliance, but also to protect their reputation. If we look at these regulations at global level, we can see some common patterns and some shared elements. These regulations generally require companies to assess risks within their entire supply chain in relation to human rights violations, environmental damage, but also unethical practices. In the most advanced cases, the legislators are even asking companies to identify risks connected to their downstream broader value chain, so in connection with the distribution of their products or even their end use. These regulations somehow resonate what has already been anticipated in voluntary standards over the last years. For example, the due diligence guidelines issued by the OECD organization. But by making these new regulations a mandatory requirement on companies, creates, of course, unexpected challenges for the boards, for procurement professionals, for the market in general. We do not aim at entering into the detail of the relevant laws. However, a quick overview might help understanding what are the main features from the most relevant and most critical laws to this regard. We have identified some common patterns and pillars within these regulations. To start with, they typically require a proper governance of these topics, starting from the commitment of management, availability and implementation of relevant policies and procedures, training and capacity building within the affected companies. And then secondly, and not less important, the risk assessment. This is the core of most supply chain due diligence laws, the ability of companies to evaluate the presence and the level of risk of such negative occurrences across the supply chain or the value chain. This requires proper risk assessment techniques and capabilities, but a prerequisite is also the traceability of the supply chain. So mapping the existing business relationships, not only with tier one suppliers, but potentially with also indirect suppliers or subcontractors. A risk assessment is the starting point, but the regulations will then also ask companies to appropriately manage and address such risks. So the means and the ways to demonstrate the proper management of such risks will be key. And we will be talking a little bit around this area. So we will explain how preventive and mitigation measures, but also remediation measures in case of actual impacts are more frequently required and what some of these measures can look like. Finally, there is one advanced requirement in connection with some of the due diligence laws and connected to an overall principle of accountability or transparency. It's not sufficient to have proper governance, risk assessment, and mitigation measures in place. It's also required to communicate to stakeholders, to authorities or the wider public, the general performance of the company, the risks identified, the actions taken. And this connects to the broader topic of disclosure and sustainability reporting in general. For a short and high-level overview and benchmarking of relevant laws in place, we have decided to start from the German Due Diligence Act, which entered into force last year. And it is quite a significant law, at least for the European continent and market, since it resembles very much this framework that we have just illustrated. If you look at a summary of the main provisions within the German law, you can see that companies need to have a clear strategy, incorporate such strategy into its business and procurement operations, build on a solid risk assessment activity, but then implement also the necessary prevention and mitigation measures against such risks. We also found quite interesting to point out that the first complaint when the law entered into force last year raised to the German authorities was by civil society groups in connection to a safety deficiency identified along the supply chain. So thousands of kilometers from Germany in Bangladesh, safety deficiencies were identified at factories supplying the German companies, and this issue was brought to the German relevant agency as an example of ineffective or insufficient monitoring of the supply chain. Whether such cases will become more frequent in the future or what type of actions will be taken by authorities in front of such allegations is partly to be seen, but that may become mainstream. It may become a common issue for companies to face and to deal with. And to remain in Europe, a very important piece of legislation was approved quite recently in July by the European Union, introducing a directive which will become applicable for all the EU members. It will enter into force starting from 2027, and after a transition period, it will be fully applicable from 2029. It will affect larger companies, but interestingly, not just to EU-based companies, but also to foreign companies with a net turnover in the EU above 450 million euros. So also American companies with business operations in the European Union. This directive will also be enforced with a risk of penalties to non-compliant companies. These could include fines, the amount of which is yet to be defined. This will be decided by the member states during the transition period. The main provisions of this directive also resemble the framework we illustrated earlier. The existence of a strategic approach to due diligence, integration into existing policies and management systems, a solid risk assessment across the entire supply chain, and also downstream partly, so within the broader value chain. Companies will also have to demonstrate that they put in place the necessary prevention, mitigation, and remediation action. In addition, they need to invest in the reporting, so disclosure to the stakeholders of risks identified and actions taken. The principle of due diligence has actually been incorporated by the EU legislators in different acts issued over the last years. For example, in the deforestation regulation or the forced labor regulation. The Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive has pushed disclosure to a new level and has also made supply chain due diligence one of the mandatory items to report upon. So this is definitely a game changer, at least for the European market, and similar principles seem to be somehow quoted within this policy document by the US government. So if we come to the USA, we can see that supply chain due diligence is somehow accepted and sponsored by the federal government, at least in this national action plan, which is very explicit about due diligence on human rights issues. Due diligence, according to this policy document, should be a continuous process, should have a risk-based approach, include some level of stakeholder engagement and grievance mechanism for stakeholders, and be aligned to the existing good practices. So there is somehow an alignment with this overall trend that we observe in different countries and regions. Big difference compared to the European market is that this document is not binding, so is not creating legally binding obligations on business. At the same time, it shows at least the policy of this administration that could then be have a cascading effect on other provisions. Also importantly, the document reaffirms the role of the Customs and Border Protection Agency for enforcing existing regulations that try to limit the import in the US of goods that have been made with human rights violations and specifically with use of forced labor. This provision links to an existing and effective law in place in the US, which has some equivalent impact in terms of due diligence of the supply chain. This is the Tariff Act, which has been in place for several years, but has somehow been also enhanced and relaunched, we could say, with recent legislation being promoted in the last years. The Tariff Act gives the CBP agency the authority to detain and seize goods which are imported into the US if there is reasonable information, even though it's not conclusive, but it's sufficient that the information is reasonable for the agency to indicate that the goods have been produced by means of forced labor. If the importers are unable to provide clear evidence that the goods have not been manufactured with use of forced labor, the goods can be seized, or the importer is forced to re-export them, or they could even be destroyed. And this is a real business impact because according to the data from the agency, almost 4,000 shipments have been stopped for enforcement actions over a period of 9 months. This, of course, has a direct consequence on the bottom line of the affected companies. And according to the agency, millions of dollars have been spent by affected companies in remediating on the root cause, the reasons for the enforcement action. So this has included repayment of wages to the workers affected or recruitment fees. And this is on top of the delays on the importing or any other consequence for seizure of goods or their destruction. The border agency has also the authority to seize goods which have been imported specifically from the Xinjiang region in China. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act has created the so-called rebuttable presumption that goods mined, produced, or manufactured in this specific region in China has been made with forced labor. And exceptions to this presumption are admitted under the law, but we know from practical experience that the CBP has a very strict approach with regards to clear and convincing evidence that any shipment coming from this region or any goods or merchandise that has been produced from this region is not fitting within this presumption. So if we look at the data provided by the agency, we can see that almost 10,000 shipments have already been subject to connected enforcement actions for a total value of more than $3.5 billion. A similar presumption also applies to goods that are in total or in part produced with labor from North Korea. So the ability of business to map their suppliers, learn where their suppliers are located, also their sub-suppliers, their tier N suppliers, and also the working conditions across their supply chains becomes key to avoid this type of penalties or unwanted consequences. It's quite interesting also to see that state legislators are moving in this direction. We quote here only one of the most known acts to this regard, the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act, mainly because it was one of the first acts, also at global level, to raise the topic of proper due diligence. The act requires sellers and manufacturers above a certain size to disclose their efforts to, again, remove human trafficking, forced labor, slavery from their supply chains. As a minimum, the affected companies must disclose on their website efforts in 5 areas: on verification, audits, certification, internal accountability, and training to eradicate this problem. Even though the Act does not contemplate specific financial penalties, the state authorities can still initiate civil actions for non-compliant companies. Other laws have been discussed or are in the pipeline at state level, at federal level. A lot, of course, will depend on political developments, but despite the variations in geographical regions, a clear trend seems to apply globally. When these regulations come in place, as is the case in many countries, there is a level of uncertainty, especially in the initial phase, about the requirements, about their interpretation, about the expected level of implementation. So certainly one of the challenges for affected companies is to build capacity internally, to create the necessary awareness and understanding of the obligations. But even after having reached the necessary competence, still these regulations will require an increased effort on companies to map their supply chain relationships, to set up resources internally and know how to manage these obligations. And this will have a direct implementation cost, especially when we will present monitoring solutions and remediation actions that can be taken across the supply chain. At the core of this is the ability of companies to reduce this effort and this cost by leveraging on professional activities, on best practice solutions, and integrating this within their business operations. I'm happy, therefore, to leave the stage to Harald, who will introduce Prewave and their services to support business achieve this level of compliance. Harald, over to you.
Thank you so much, Alberto, and hello, everybody. My name is Harald. I'm co-founder and CEO of Prewave. Prewave, we are a technology company supporting today more than 200 companies in having resilient, sustainable, and compliant supply chains. And we really specialize in the use of artificial intelligence and automation for the risk assessment and supply chain mapping part of the various compliance laws and challenges that Alberto just mentioned. You see here some of our customers today. We work today with customers across various industries, many of the large automotive, both OEMs, but also suppliers, but also many other large manufacturing companies that you see here. And we have on our platform, and Prewave release a platform model, software as a service platform model, where we have more than 1 million suppliers already scored and available to be basically assessed as part of your own supply chain. Now, if we go a step further, I mentioned it before, the core technology behind Prewave goes back to PhD research at the University of Technology Vienna. And we enable really 3 fundamental use cases for our customers. That's on the one hand ensuring that supply chains are resilient and can, in that, withstand disruption events such as natural disasters, geopolitical events, and for such topics, transparency into the supply chain and a good and proactive risk assessment of suppliers is absolutely key. But the same effort invested into building transparency for the supply chain for resilience also pays off when you move into the other use cases and these compliance challenges that Alberto mentioned. So we also address sustainability and ESG use cases, for instance, monitoring or assessing suppliers around critical human rights or environmental risks. And last but not least, it's then about leveraging that for these many compliance challenges. And Alberto already mentioned quite a few of them and gave you a good overview. So I will not go into detail on any of them, but I think the message just remains that this is really getting out of hand to some extent. It's getting more and more pressure on companies to comply from both individual nations, but then also the European Union that is placing now a special regulatory pressure on supply chain sustainability from a human rights perspective, but also an environmental perspective. And also, of course, the USA, but also Canada recently followed up with one of their laws. And from a company perspective, and this is really what we see, we work today with customers, large enterprises that are affected by sometimes even close to a dozen of these regulations at the same time. That puts pressure on the procurement departments, who are often then tasked with fulfilling these challenges of assessing supplier risk and providing certain data points and mapping supply chains. And let's say they really are worried to see, with this increasing regulatory pressure, to also have the internal effort and the resources that are required to fulfill that to be sort of ever increasing or exponentially increasing. And at Prewave, it's kind of our mission to leverage artificial intelligence, but also a clear focus on kind of automation and the end-to-end solution approach to make sure that companies can fulfill these regulatory requirements while keeping a manageable amount of resource dedication and workload, which then actually allows companies to also retrieve some of the value that some of these legislations bring, because a more sustainable supply chain helps companies on the sales and marketing side, on the positioning on the market. A more resilient supply chain is one that is less vulnerable to losses, and transparency is useful for both of these challenges. So maybe I explained now a lot what challenges we solve, but maybe also one or two slides on how we actually do it. So at the core of Prewave is artificial intelligence that we started developing back in 2012 as part of PhD research. Back then it was kind of the new age of social media, and it was becoming clear that more and more data is really publicly available. We as humans are producing more and more publicly available data, and there's really a lot of opportunity to leverage that and to make use of that. And that was, let's say, the focus of the PhD research that we did. But then we transformed that into a startup that we founded in 2017. And yeah, today grew into a global company. So we have already offices in 5 countries, and we'll take soon the step into the US as well. But technologically, what we do is we are transforming these publicly available data points. These could be news media data, social media data, websites of suppliers and companies, availability of certifications, even annual reports, any kind of public filings of these companies, data sets from governments and NGOs about certain risk indicators. sanction lists, but also customs data, bill of lading data that we use for some supply chain mapping purposes. That is transformed into essentially 3 key features that we offer on the platform. The first one we call monitoring. So that is essentially a real-time view into what's happening with your suppliers. You receive alerts in more than 150 risk categories. Maybe let me skip quickly to that particular slide. So covering more than 150 risk categories, ranging from disruption-related risks, from political unrest to natural disasters to cyber risks, financial risks, all the way then to those topics that are more often in the focus of these legislations that Alberto presented, which are human rights and environmental risk factors. And we cover these holistically and then allow our customers to sort of have different perspectives on their suppliers. So some of the procurement and supply chain professionals at our customers view suppliers from more disruption angle, whereas others have a perspective on the supplier which is more driven by ESG or compliance topics. Now back to the previous slide. So besides scoring of, besides monitoring suppliers, there we go. So besides the monitoring of suppliers, we are also scoring suppliers in these 150 categories. So each supplier gets a scorecard where we combine country and industry risk indicators with a view on the historical incidents at this particular supplier based on news and media data. So let's say we have a chemical supplier in China, for instance. We already perceive, based on the country industry risk and an elevated risk profile for environmental risks. Then we might observe in media data that there's also been, maybe in the last 5 years, 2 chemical accidents at that plant. All of that would contribute to the scorecard. And then in addition, we are also considering things like certifications and any other indicators of the maturity of that company. And of course, any actions and additional trainings, audits that Alberto will introduce from TÜV Süd can also be integrated into that scorecard to complete the picture for the supplier. And the last point that we offer is this piece around supply chain mapping. So building a view into the deeper supply chain, going beyond the first tier, but into the second and third tiers and beyond. Again, by using a combination of publicly available data, artificial intelligence, but also then engaging the supplier to validate their supply chains and map the supply chains collaboratively. Now, one of the use cases that we have to present is our project with the Volkswagen Group. So Audi, Porsche, and Volkswagen are using Prewave now for several years to monitor and assess more than 50,000 of their tier 1 suppliers, but in fact also several thousand of their sub-tier, so we call it tier N suppliers in 16 critical raw materials such as cobalt or nickel or copper or aluminum. And they receive then an assessment, but also risk alerts around these suppliers that they then process internally to follow up on these risks, start incident management and case management workflows to oftentimes proactively address these risks. And as part of that project, we also did several benchmarkings where the Volkswagen Group identified that through Prewave, they were really able to identify these problems at suppliers much, much earlier, sometimes up to several months earlier than they would have through other, let's say, traditional channels. And lastly, we also offer a risk assessment process, which is a step-by-step process of identifying out of a large number of suppliers. Again, Volkswagen Group could be 50,000 suppliers or more. Those suppliers that should be prioritized for further mitigation actions. And here we follow a step-by-step process that's aligned with the requirements of, for instance, the German Supply Chain Act, but also the European Union CSDDD, so the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which both assesses prioritized tier 1 suppliers, where we have an initial assessment, also identify the critical supply chains that should be mapped. So not all of the suppliers need to be mapped in depth, but from the perspective of the due diligence legislations in Europe, it's only in certain risk areas. For instance, battery supply chains would be such an example, where you would then map the supply chains and then essentially funnel step by step by adding further risk information as we go along in the funnel to get a picture of who are the true risk suppliers that we are working with. And at Prewave, we are supporting this process in a highly automated and artificial intelligence supported manner. So the risk suppliers are those that are then suggested and recommended for mitigation actions on what we call the action platform. And the action platform is really a way for our customers to then engage with their suppliers. And here TÜV Süd is our partner on this action platform, which is essentially a way to integrate then the various and broad mitigation actions that TÜV Süd offers directly and neatly into the Prewave scorecard of the supplier, so that a risk supplier can be transformed through various actions such as trainings or audits into a non-risk supplier in a seamlessly integrated way. And with that, I hand it back to you, Alberto, to tell us about these various mitigation options that TÜV Süd offers.
Thank you, Harald. And I think your funneling approach is really key. And I would like to insist how important it is the risk prioritization for an effective approach. Regulators do not expect companies to be almighty and solve all instances of poor performance across a supply chain or value chain with all levels of their business relationship. So proper mapping of the supply chain and risk assessment is key and is a prerequisite for appropriate measures then to be implemented. Appropriateness is really the key, which is proportionality with the level of risk identified, but also the capacity to influence. And we have seen several actions developed over time for appropriate risk mitigation measures. What is key is this level of proportionality with the impact that these measures can have. There is a level of actions that can be taken at a broader level, let's say, for a wider pool of suppliers, starting with the definition of a code of conduct reflecting the company policies and expectations towards business partners, and the cascading of these expectations. The risk analysis is something that should be comprehensive, equally, should cover the entire supply chain, and then by implementing the funneling approach, Prewave will help you, as Harald shows, to identify which suppliers can be regarded at higher risk. And that's where then you want to focus your efforts. You want to demonstrate that you have an approach, that you put in place active measures that are proportionate to the level of risk perceived. Contractual assurance is one of the useful means that can be implemented by integrating the code of conduct and the policy expectations into the contractual relationship with direct suppliers. This is normally done by making a direct reference to the code of conduct in the terms and conditions, or engaging suppliers into direct training and capability and capacity building. Then with an increased level of risk, you probably want also to gather more information about your affected suppliers by means of a questionnaire, self-assessment, additional specifically targeted information. You may also want to partner with some of the rating providers to have an evaluation of documentation and information available. There are multiple providers of this kind. Normally, they work out of documentation which is publicly available or that is specifically provided by the supplier. Where we would like to focus our attention is on auditing activities. As Harald mentioned, TÜV is able to offer this solution, these tools for ensuring that proper measures are in place to address the level of risk identified. This can be by means of dedicated audits, but also the, let's say, traditional certification audits can play a role. These were also mentioned in one of the slides from Harald, how the certification information of suppliers is one key element to evaluate their level of risk. And certifications demonstrate that suppliers have a proactive approach to relevant topic. They have management system in place to ensure compliance over time, and their systems have been validated by an independent party. This means could be included, therefore, as a tool for strengthening the business relationship with suppliers. But I would also like to show you briefly how ESG audits and dedicated supplier audits can help improve your level of knowledge and monitoring of suppliers and support your efforts also for onboarding suppliers and increasing their awareness and understanding of your expectations. Different tools, therefore, and solutions exist for demonstrating proper measures in place for supply chain due diligence. One of these is, therefore, the traditional, let's say, third-party certification. This is certainly a way for suppliers to proactively demonstrate their governance as well as their performance. It's a way of also encouraging suppliers to take an active role in promoting their own capability and improving their profile with their entire client base. Certifications are a universal language in the sense they are globally recognized for their scope, for their applicability, and for their validity. There are a variety of certifications out there. Sometimes it can be difficult to navigate into these certifications. We have only selected 3 of them in the broad field of sustainability or ESG. ISO 14001 is the most widely known certification on general environmental management. Equally, there is one for the management of occupational health and safety within workplaces. That's ISO 45001. But there are other topic-specific certifications, for example, one on proper energy management system, and that's ISO 50001. So multiple certifications exist. It's not easy to navigate into the applicability and relevance of these certifications, but they can also support the vendor evaluation and the vendor approval process. They can support the contractual assurance. They can be integrated into the procurement process as one of the preferential means or even as an exclusion ground for contracting reputable and certified suppliers. Over time, some initiatives have also been created at global level to support the suppliers in profiling themselves among their client base. These are called collaborative solutions, and their main goal is to ensure data sharing and mutual recognition. Some of these initiatives are listed here. They are often industry specific. Sometimes they're also topic specific. Some of them focus on human rights compliance, others focus on environmental performance. At the core, they work on the idea that sustainability-related information should be shared among the relevant players, typically members of these collaborative initiatives, by reducing the effort of demonstrating a proper compliance. In addition, another solution is by demonstrating a proactive approach by clients. So in this case, buyer companies take a proactive approach towards the monitoring of their suppliers by means of supplier audits of second-party nature, often in a customized manner. This is technically quite different from a third-party certification audit. And the main fundamental difference is the responsible party here and the effort mostly on the buyer side in this case, as opposed to the certified supplier in the previous scenario. We believe that supplier audits effectively support the due diligence efforts, and this is recognized by the regulators. In many of the acts, we see explicit reference to supplier audits. This is the case for the Transparency in Supply Chains Act, for example, but also the European Union Directive. They specifically mention supplier audits as one of the tools to demonstrate proactive management and proper management of risks within the supply chain. Of course, such audits need to be arranged in a way that ensure their effectiveness. So they are performed by professional auditors in an objective and independent manner. A crucial element of such audits is the ability to build on top of the information which is publicly available or available from documents. So that's why we strongly support on-site supplier audits as a mean to deepen the knowledge of the affected suppliers. And this is the typical workflow of audits. You may be familiar with starting from an opening meeting, but including also a visual inspection of facilities and workplaces, interviews with relevant internal or even external stakeholders, on top of review of additional documents. We have embedded these best practice activities and techniques into a solution called ESG supplier audit. The goal of these audits is to provide to clients a feedback on the supplier's level of maturity to achieve goals in the overall field of ESG and address compliance with relevant regulations and standards. By means of on-site activities performed by our professional auditors across different countries, and by use of a checklist that we have developed specifically for this purpose. All the auditors are qualified for this type of activities based on their competence and experience, and they can also be trained and calibrated on customer requirements and needs if needed, so that the supplier audits can also be tailored to specific requirements or expectations. The topics covered include the main ESG pillars and aspects addressed by the due diligence regulations, and TÜV is capable of managing the audit process end-to-end. So once we are provided with information on your concerned suppliers, in application, if possible, of the funneling approach, so especially on your high-risk suppliers, then we would plan the activities, prepare and perform the audits in collaboration with the concerned supplier, and after the necessary quality checks, we release the report to the commissioning client. Different solutions, therefore, exist for supply chain monitoring, from supplier certifications to second-party audits. And the first question to answer is who takes the first action, who takes a main responsibility, but also the cost of the resources to be involved, the development of the project or its implementation. Data management should not be underestimated as one of the side effects of having a proper supply chain monitoring project, especially when a large supply chain is involved and there may be thousands of suppliers affected. So that's why partnering with digital companies and tech providers like Prewave becomes essential to prioritize. To navigate the complexity of sustainable supply chain management, we have created a so-called supply chain navigator, which you can access through this QR code already. You may also be able to click on the link once you will receive the slides. It will lead you to a web-based self-assessment questionnaire made up of a few questions around some key chapters. It will not be long to complete, and it will allow you to self-evaluate your maturity level when it comes to integration of sustainability considerations into your procurement processes. And then based on the results, the tool will provide some suggestions also for next steps and possibly for some solutions that can support your journey towards a more sustainable procurement process or due diligence effort. TÜV has a variety of services that can support this regard. We have focused today on supplier audits as a means to demonstrate your monitoring and the appropriate management and mitigation of risks across the supply chain. But we also offer training services to enhance your awareness and your internal capability, as well as gap analysis against relevant standards and best practices in risk management, corporate social responsibility, or sustainable procurement. I encourage you to visit our e-shop for trainings relevant on sustainability and corporate social responsibility, some of them relevant specifically to the topic of due diligence, but in general, they are very useful for enhancing your level of understanding of these topics and creating the necessary level of awareness internally. And with that, I am done with the presentation slides, and then I let Susan take over and let us know if there is any question from the audience.
Okay, thanks Alberto and Harald. Great job today. Thanks so much for sharing your wisdom and expertise on assessing risk and monitoring performance in the supply chain. So we do have a couple questions that have been submitted. I know we have just a few minutes left, but maybe we can take a couple of these questions. So the first question is, due diligence relevant only for companies with overseas suppliers? I don't know, Alberto, Harald, who wants to take that one?
I can take that because it may be connected to my presentation of some US laws relevant for the importing of goods into the national market. So it may seem that issues are only connected with overseas suppliers. From a compliance point of view, there is, of course, a higher level of risk in connection with such importing. But if we look at brand risks and reputation risks, Harald was very clear about it. These can come from multiple sources and directions, and not just overseas suppliers or manufacturing suppliers in developing countries where environmental protections may be lower or human rights conditions may be more poor. There could be situations very local. This could be in the US, in Europe, in other advanced economies. Sometimes they may be hidden within the supply chain, not among the direct suppliers, but within subcontractors or tier N suppliers. So I would say look at the risks where they lie based on a combination of factors and not just the geographical element of your supply chain.
Okay, great. Thanks, Alberto. We do have another question that just came in. And Harald, I know you alluded to some use cases and case studies. Can you share a case study of ESG supplier audits?
I would also
Maybe
pass
that's
it to
more
you.
for TÜV Süd, as we have presented this service, which is also offered through the Prewave Action platform to our clients. And yes, we do have some case studies we did not present through this webinar, also for confidentiality reasons, but I'd like to share that TÜV Süd itself is on top of a supply chain and is bound to demonstrate the proper management of its responsibilities and risks. And our headquarters is also in Germany, so since last year we have to demonstrate compliance to local legislation. And Prewave supports our procurement colleagues and the board in demonstrating our proper risk management. And we have also taken some supplier audits for our own benefit. And we have decided to use our own methodology and to deploy it not just as a service to our clients, but also for our own benefit. We have tested in a few countries, including also within Germany itself, on some suppliers that were regarded as potentially at higher risk than others, which also demonstrates that being headquartered in a country regarded as generally low risk does not put you necessarily in the comfort zone.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Alberto. So we do have a few more minutes. Here's another question that came in. Are companies across all industries susceptible to sustainability violations in their supply chain, or does this apply only to certain industries?
Yeah, maybe I can try to answer that one. So the regulations and the compliance pressures are not restricted to any industries, but these regulations are typically risk-based and purely based on the risk factors. Certain industries simply have a higher risk for human rights or environmental risks in the supply chain. Think about the textile industry, also some of the raw material industries. Certainly a higher risk for certain issues and abuses in their value chain. And let's say for many then more manufacturing companies or even more services oriented companies, the risks might lie somewhere not within the direct suppliers but within the supply chains, and the risk picture and the, let's say, breadth of the risk assessment would certainly differ for companies where in general they have a less risky supply base or less risky supply chain. But the laws themselves are not restricted to certain industries.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Harald. Okay, I see it's 1 minute to go. Just real quick, do I contact TÜV Süd if I want to participate in a collaborative initiative?
Collaborative initiatives mentioned during my presentation are independent from TÜV-SÜD. They are typically managed by their own organization. They are membership initiatives. They can be contacted and an application can be submitted to them. TÜV-SÜD partners with these initiatives for the auditing element. So we then are member ourselves or we work with the member companies in performing audits, either on their own operations or their supplier operations.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Alberto. Okay, well, we're just at the top of the hour, just about. Thank you, Alberto and Harald, again, for a great presentation today on sustainability in the supply chain. And I want to thank all of our participants on today's webinar. For any questions that we did not have time to address, we will provide written answers and follow up with you after the event. And as a reminder, the recording will be available soon after if you or your colleagues missed any portion of today's session. And be sure to visit www.tufsud.com to learn more about our sustainability in the supply chain initiatives. Thanks again for joining, and we'll be in touch soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.